I spent months looking for the perfect dress to wear for my daughter's big day. My heart was pounding as I showed it to her, and her answer took my breath away. "Mum," she said, "the party was yesterday." I hadn't been invited. It wasn't an oversight. It was something more. In that moment, I swore I wouldn't scream or cry, but I also wouldn't ignore what I had just learned. What I did next wasn't revenge. It was a lesson that she would remember forever. And today, I want to tell you how a dress that was never worn ended up changing the relationship with my daughter forever. They say when a mother walks through the mall looking for a dress, she isn't buying fabric, she's buying a memory. Linda, a mature woman, 58 years old, with a firm stride, walked into the boutique in Manhattan with the calm of someone who could pay without haggling. The afternoon light streamed through the display windows and gave the silk a sheen like an old promise. She chose a sophisticated, dignified burgundy color, one of those that says, "I'm here," without shouting. As her fingers brushed the fabric, she felt a tingling sensation, as if the music were already beginning. She looked in the mirror and saw herself holding her daughter's hand, slowly spinning, quietly laughing. "This is the one," she thought, and the smile came all by itself, without permission. She didn't know that destiny, stubborn as always, was preparing a lump in her throat. She returned home with the bag held close to her chest, like someone guarding a sweet secret. The door opened to that scent of flowers she loved so much. Orderly, a lived-in home, the peace of a woman who owes nothing to anyone. Her daughter was on the couch, her fingers flying over her cell phone, her gaze fixed on some distant screen. "My sweet girl, I have the dress I'm going to wear to your party now," Linda said, with that voice that trembles with pure emotion. The young woman barely looked up, a small, almost negligible gesture, and dropped the words like throwing a stone into the water. "Mum," she said, "the party was yesterday." The sentence didn't just hit. It pierced through, lodging inside like a sliver of fine glass. The silence stretched, heavy, and the walls seemed to inch closer. If anyone had seen her, they would say nothing happened, that she only blinked a little slower. But you learn to see the cracks from the inside. And inside Linda, something cracked. "Yesterday," she managed to murmur, grasping for some kind of explanation. The girl pursed her lips, as if annoyed at having to justify the obvious. "Yeah, the date changed. You know, last-minute stuff," she replied without meeting her mother's gaze. Linda held the bag tight, so the future wouldn't fall out of her hands. She sat down slowly, with that dignity no one gave her, that she earned through sheer effort, and a burning question ignited deep within her eyes. Why without me? One might think money buys seats at the table, but it doesn't buy chairs in the heart. Linda was not lacking. She had stories. She was not in a hurry. She had memory. She sat there measuring the weight of the disappointment, like someone touching a wound without opening it. "You should have told me," she said softly, being careful that her voice didn't break more than necessary. Her daughter made a gesture, somewhere between a weak apology and a rush to end the topic. "It was impromptu, Mum. Everything went fine, don't worry," she finished, looking down. "Don't worry" sounded like closing a door from the inside, and Linda was left with her hands dangling, full of nothing. The house, so much her own, became unfamiliar for a moment, as if the echo didn't recognize her. She took a deep breath, that old trick of a woman who has survived other storms. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't resort to words that weigh heavy later. She just placed the bag next to her, as one sits a silent friend. She looked at the dress for a second and covered it again, protecting it from the harsh air. "Do you want to see it?" she tried gently, more out of tender habit than hope. The young woman shook her head, distracted, her fingers dancing on the screen again. And in that detached dance, Linda understood that the rhythm was no longer the same. Sometimes life doesn't break you head on, it bends you sideways. She straightened herself inside, remembered who she was and where she came from, remembered nights of fever, improvised snacks, dancing in the kitchen in socks. She remembered her daughter's childhood promises. "Mum, when I turn 15, you'll be my queen." The memories, so vivid, didn't fit into that yesterday that left her out. "That's fine," she said, with the calm of someone who doesn't negotiate their dignity. She didn't ask for details, didn't ask for pictures, didn't ask for what wouldn't heal anything now. She saved the rest for another time, not yet knowing which one. If anyone asked me, I'd say, "That's what love looks like when it doesn't want to hurt. It bites its tongue, puts its hands in its pockets, swallows its pride with cold water." Linda wasn't one for fights. She was one for silences that teach. Her daughter glanced at her sideways, wanting to close the chapter without learning the lesson. The clock advanced a few minutes, but inside Linda, a lifetime passed, a life in which she understood that affection without respect is mere window dressing. The dress was still there, patient, like a silent witness, and her heart was taking stitches to keep from splitting wide open. "And why didn't you let me know?" she finally asked, softly, like someone knocking on a stranger's door. The answer came quickly. "Everything was fast, Mum. Don't take it personally." That phrase, "don't take it personally," is usually used by someone who doesn't want to take responsibility. Linda nodded, not because she agreed, but to avoid wearing herself out on dry ground. She stood up with an old-world elegance, the kind that cannot be bought or bragged about. "Well," she said, "I'm glad it went well for you." Joy? It was more of a wish that her daughter's happiness wouldn't need to hurt her. And even so, the thorn remained, carefully lodged so it would hurt slowly. When a mother is silent, it's not because she has nothing to say, it's because she chooses when to say it. Linda walked to her room, her steps even, her gaze serene, her back straight. She hung the dress in the closet, giving it air, as if it needed to breathe. She washed her hands with warm water, trying to rinse the phrase stuck to her skin. She looked in the mirror and saw a complete woman, not a shadow of anyone else. "I'm here," she told herself, with a small but firm faith. That old mantra reminded her that her story wouldn't end in a slight, and that silence, properly used, is a fine tool. From the window, the city carried on with its usual noise: vendors, laughter, motorcycles, life. The house, once again, was home, because she inhabited it, and that was enough. She poured herself black coffee, because the day already tasted both sweet and bitter. She sat down slowly, like someone preparing her soul to understand. There are wounds that don't bleed, but they change your stride, she thought, looking at the cup. She didn't look for culprits. She looked for signs. At what moment did our hands let go? And she found no answer. She only found one certainty: never again had beg for affection. That small certainty began to take root. After a while, her daughter poked her head through the door, like someone checking the weather. "Mum, I'm going out. Do you need anything?" Linda offered a half smile, that brief smile that doesn't break. "No, honey, thank you. Drive safe," she said, giving her peace even though it wasn't requested. The young woman nodded, a kiss in the air, a soft closing of the door, the sound of the engine starting. The house returned to silence, a clean silence, without resentment, without drama. Linda's heart beat steadily now, without a jolt, and in that new rhythm, She heard the first idea of something that would soon take shape. You don't raise children with yelling. You raise them with boundaries, her own mother would have said. Linda remembered it and felt memory reaching out a hand to her. She wasn't going to punish. She was going to teach, which is absolutely not the same thing. She thought about the value of her presence, not as a favor, but as a deserved right. She thought about how easy it is to get people accustomed to our automatic yes, and how costly it is later when the time comes to say, not anymore. She took a deep breath and let the idea ripen slowly, because the best decisions are cooked over a low flame. The dress, hanging there, seemed to look at her, asking what would become of it. Linda approached and smoothed a tiny wrinkle with her fingertip. "Don't worry," she murmured. "There will be a moment for you." That moment had no date, but it had a destiny, because dignity, when dressed well, always finds a ballroom. The woman closed the closet, and with it, she also closed the urgency to explain everything. She wasn't going to apologize for being hurt, nor was she going to beg for belated invitations. If you had seen her that night, you would have understood that self-love also shines a light. She lit a small candle in the living room, her custom of giving thanks for what remains. She gave thanks for her health, her house, her bread, her clean name, the strength in her hands. She asked for clarity, so as not to react with anger or fear. She asked for patience to choose well the words that had not yet been born. And very secretly, she asked that her daughter would one day learn to look people straight in the eye. The flame flickered, as if saying, "I'm here." And with that small company, the night became kinder. Up to this point, friend reader, there is a lesson that beats without shouting. Pain teaches if you let it. Linda didn't run after anyone. She didn't make herself small. She didn't play the victim. She stayed in her place, whole, allowing her heart to take a seat. Because the next step, the one that comes next, is not taken in a hurry. It is taken with a cool head and a warm soul, like a good family recipe. And if you ask me what follows, I'll tell you that the story is only now finding its tone. Because where others see an end, a wise woman sees a beginning. And that door, believe me, is about to open at the exact right moment. When the door closed behind her daughter, the echo clung to the walls. It was not an empty silence. It was one of those that carries weight, like an invisible sack on the shoulders. Linda sat at the table, her hands open on the wood, feeling her veins pulse beneath her skin. She did not cry, not yet. Tears are stubborn. They know when to come out and when to stay in. She looked at the wall clock, and the second hand seemed to laugh at her, reminding her that yesterday was only a few hours away. She bit her lip, not from physical pain, but to prevent the anger from escaping as words. That day she understood that silence can make more noise than a slammed door, and that sometimes the best answer is to give none at all. The cell phone was on the table, still, as if it also knew there was nothing more to say. Linda thought about calling, demanding explanations, asking for the pictures, the laughter, the names. But her pride whispered in her ear, "Don't lower yourself." She looked up and saw her reflection in the window. A strong woman, tired, but standing. She remembered that people only give you the value that you first give yourself. And that night, more than ever, she decided that she wasn't going to give away her dignity. A faint smell of cold coffee and fading flowers floated in the air. It was as if the house also knew that something had broken. She leaned back in the chair and let the memories parade like old black and white movies. The little girl with braids who ran to her bed after a nightmare. The teenager who got angry over silly things, but always came back with a hug. The conversations in the kitchen, the late-night confessions, the silly laughter for no reason. All of it felt so far away, as if it belonged to another family. And deep down, what hurt the most wasn't the missed party. It was the certainty that her daughter had learned to live important moments without her. That, she thought, is the real abandonment. The street outside continued with its life. Vendors shouting, engines roaring, children playing. Inside, the house was so quiet that even the sound of her own breathing felt foreign. She got up, walked to the kitchen, and poured herself a glass of water. "If I speak now, I'll only make things worse," she told herself, letting the water slowly go down her throat. It was a thought that tasted like patience, but also like loneliness. Because keeping quiet so as not to break things is also a way of breaking yourself inside. And Linda knew that well. Night fell without asking permission, painting the walls with long shadows. Linda turned on a lamp with warm light, as if to ward off the feeling of emptiness. She sat in the armchair, hugging a cushion, not looking at the television that was turned on. She wasn't listening to the news. She was listening to the echo of her own thoughts. What went wrong? At what point did they become so distant? The answers hid like mischievous children, running before they could be caught. Suddenly, she felt more tired than usual. But it wasn't physical exhaustion. It was soul weariness, the kind that sleep doesn't cure. The lamp illuminated the dress, still hanging on the hanger, like a small lighthouse in the middle of a shipwreck. Linda got up and took it in her hands, stroking the fabric. It was beautiful, and it was full of a meaning that no one else understood. It wasn't just clothing. It was time. It was hope. It was a bridge to her daughter that was now broken. She put it away again, carefully closing the closet door, as if she could seal the pain inside. But she knew it didn't work that way. Emotions can't be stored in a piece of furniture. She got into bed early, even though she wasn't sleepy. She wanted to escape the day, but the day still wouldn't let her go. That morning, the silence woke up again. It was like an annoying visitor who insists on staying too long. Linda listened to the sounds of the house, the creaking of the wood, the sigh of the wind in the windows. She realized that she missed even the sound of her daughter's voice, even when it came with complaints. She didn't want to admit it, but that distance sounded like a disguised goodbye. And at that moment, she promised herself that if she had to leave, she wouldn't do it by begging. Pride isn't edible, but it feeds you in another way, and that would be her food in the days to come. The next morning dawned warm, with the smell of fresh-baked bread from the corner bakery. Linda got up, put on a soft sweater, and went to pour herself coffee. Her morning ritual soothed her, heating the water, smelling the aroma, listening to the bubbling. She poured it into her favorite mug, the one that said "Mom" in letters worn by time. She looked at it for a moment and thought, how ironic, isn't it? The irony tasted bitter, but it also gave her a kind of strength. Sometimes, internal sarcasm is the armor that prevents you from being pierced again, and she was ready to start using hers. The day proceeded without haste. Linda did her chores, tidied the living room, watered the plants, talked for a while with a neighbor. But during every pause, the silence came and sat beside her again. It no longer hurt like the night before, but it weighed heavily. And in that weight, there was a lesson beginning to take shape. Not all wounds heal with words. Some only heal with distance. She didn't know it yet, but that silence was going to become her sharpest weapon. And with it, she would soon take the first step toward a justice that doesn't shout, but is felt. Because there are moments in life when one understands that absence is also a message. Linda wasn't planning to disappear, but to stop being constantly available. It was time for her daughter to understand what it means to rely on someone, to value what she had taken for granted until now. And that is not taught with speeches, it is taught with actions. So, with her heart wrapped in cold calm, she began to draw up an invisible plan. It wasn't revenge, it was education, but an education that would hurt enough to never be forgotten. And so the silence, the same one that had arrived as an uncomfortable shadow, began to turn into an ally. Linda molded it in her mind, giving it the shape of a lesson. She knew that everything she kept quiet now would be stronger when it was revealed at the right moment. That's why she wasn't in a hurry. She let life take its course, letting her daughter live her days without suspecting anything. Meanwhile, she watched, learned, and waited. Because in these kinds of battles, patience is the most lethal strategy. And Linda, even though her daughter had forgotten it, was always a strategist. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, when the sun was barely filtering through the curtain slits and the house was in that post-lunch calm. It was her daughter. The voice sounded softer than Linda expected, like someone testing the ground before entering. "Mum, can we talk?" She settled into her chair, the cold coffee in her hands, and replied with a, "Sure, tell me," that was neither rushed nor warm. The young woman took a deep breath before letting it out. "I didn't mean to make you feel bad the other day, but you know how things are." Linda listened. Yes, but she also measured every word, like someone weighing coins before handing them over. Her daughter's pride peeked out in every syllable, as if apologizing were a luxury she couldn't afford. And that fine tension settled in the air, like a thread that could break with any abrupt movement. The conversation continued, but it reached no clear shore. She avoided looking her mother in the eyes. Linda avoided pushing her against the wall of her own guilt. She had learned that with certain people, pride is a wall that you don't tear down with blows, but one you let crumble on its own. And in that moment, her daughter was still building hers, brick by brick, as she spoke. "Don't be mad, Mum. Honestly, everything was impromptu," she repeated, as if saying it more times would make it true. Linda didn't argue, didn't lay out evidence on the table, didn't show the cracks she had seen. She just nodded slowly, giving her the space to believe her own story, because she knew that pride drowns only when it runs out of air. That afternoon, her daughter changed the subject with the ease of someone wanting to erase an entire line from a notebook. She asked about Grandma's health, about the garden flowers, about anything that wasn't the wound they had opened. Linda played the game, responding calmly, without stepping out of her role as the serene mother. But inwardly, she was noting every gesture, every evasion, every word that didn't arrive. It was like watching someone cross a bridge without realizing that boards were missing in the middle. Her daughter's pride was high, but not strong enough to hide the discomfort. Linda noticed it in the way she pressed her lips together and glanced sideways. That was the thread she would pull later. Pride, she knew well, is like a mask. It provides security, but it also prevents breathing. Linda had used hers for years, in other times, with other people, and she knew the effort it took to take it off. That's why she wouldn't rip it off in one go, because it hurts too much. She preferred to wait, to let the discomfort do its work. Each of her daughter's silences, each pause, each evasion, were small cracks in that mask. And she, patient, became a witness to that wear and tear. Not with joy, but with the firmness of someone who knows that sooner or later everything falls under its own weight. That moment would come, and Linda would greet it without raising her voice. After a while, her daughter looked at the clock as if she had remembered something urgent. "Well, Mum, I'm heading out now. We'll talk later, okay? Linda nodded, and in her okay, there was a calm that was disarming. It wasn't resignation, it was strategy. She walked her daughter to the door, gave her a kiss on the cheek, and let her go without holding her back. The young woman's pride walked by her side like an invisible bodyguard. Linda watched her walk away and thought, that bodyguard won't be there forever. And she smiled faintly, like someone who knows a secret that the other hasn't even imagined yet. When the door closed, the house returned to its measured pace. Linda stood for a moment, listening to her own footsteps in the hallway. There was no anger in them, but determination. She knew that her daughter's pride was a test she had to handle with gloves, not a hammer, and that the best way to teach her the value of humility was to let her feel the weight of her own decisions. In her mind, the pieces were beginning to fit into a larger plan. It wouldn't be today or tomorrow, but there would be a moment when her daughter would seek support. And there, Linda would decide how to respond. That night, while preparing dinner, she thought about her own youth, about how many times she had let pride cost her relationships, moments, opportunities, about how her mother, in silence, had let her learn the hard way. And now she understood that history was repeating itself, not as a punishment, but as a natural cycle. Life, sometimes, doesn't teach with hugs, but with absences. And Linda was willing to become that necessary absence. Dinner was ready, but her hunger wasn't for food. It was for justice, for balance, for teaching. On the table, the lit candle illuminated a corner of the room where the dress was still stored. Linda looked at it for a moment and understood that she no longer saw it with pain, but with purpose. That dress would be more than a forgotten outfit. It would be a symbol, a reminder, a tool. In it, she would place the lesson her daughter needed. Maybe she wouldn't wear it to a party, but she would use it to mark a moment when everything would change. Her daughter's pride was still high, but Linda was starting to have the advantage. Because while one person is busy defending themselves, they don't see the real move coming. And Linda's move was just beginning to take shape. The phone rang late at night, a short message from her daughter, an automatic sounding, "I got home safe." Linda replied with an, "I'm glad," and left the device on the table. There was no rush to say more, nor a need to fill the space with useless words. That cold exchange was part of the process, because sometimes emotional distance is the only mirror where some dare to look at themselves. And in that reflection, sooner or later, her daughter would see that her pride was not protecting her, but isolating her. Linda wouldn't force it, but she wouldn't prevent it either. Time would do its thing, as always. In the subsequent silence, Linda felt that mix of calm and expectation again. She wasn't at war, but in a kind of chess game. Every move had to be calculated, every gesture measured. Because when dealing with the pride of someone you love, you don't win by crushing them. You win by showing them that there is another way to live. Her daughter didn't know it yet, but the lesson had already begun. And Linda, patient as few are, was ready to wait for the checkmate, even if it meant remaining silent a little longer. A few days passed without long calls or impromptu visits. Linda used that silence to breathe deeply and reorganize her thoughts, like someone tidying old drawers. Until, on a Saturday afternoon, the phone rang with that tone one recognizes even while asleep. It was her daughter. The voice was wrapped in a sweet, almost syrupy tone, the kind that hadn't appeared in months. "Mum, how are you? I miss you," she said, and Linda knew immediately that something else was coming. She responded calmly, returning the courtesy, but without letting down her guard entirely. Because she knew that tone well, the one people use when they aren't just looking for company. It was the beginning of a move. The conversation started with memories and light jokes, as if suddenly nothing had happened. They talked about the weather, a new Netflix series, grandma's cooking, anything harmless. Linda played the role, even smiling, but inwardly she was measuring every word. Her heart wasn't resentful, but it was cautious. And then, after a brief silence, the disguised sentence arrived. "Mum, do you think you could help me out with some money? I kind of have this trip with some friends that came up, and I don't want to lose the chance." Linda tightened her grip on the cup, feeling the heat of the coffee rise through her fingers. There it was, the real reason for the call. She wasn't offended. She wasn't surprised. She simply let her daughter finish explaining, filling the air with details about hotels, transportation, and the small amount I'm still short. The voice sounded hopeful, as if her mother's yes were inevitable, almost automatic, because that's how it had always been. When her daughter asked, Linda found a way. She remembered times when she had cancelled her own plans just so she wouldn't let her down. But that story was about to change. This time, her answer wouldn't be wrapped in immediate sacrifice. This time, she was going to think first. Linda let the silence settle between them, a long, almost uncomfortable silence. She could feel her daughter shifting in her chair on the other end of the line, waiting. "A trip, you say?" she asked in a neutral voice, without judgment or enthusiasm. "Yes, Mum. Nothing crazy. I just have to reserve my spot now, or I'll lose it," the young woman replied, rushing her words. Linda remembered the party, remembered the hanging dress, remembered the door shut in her face without warning. And although she didn't say anything about it, she knew she was facing an opportunity. An opportunity to teach without raising her voice. An opportunity to set a boundary. Instead of outright refusing, Linda decided to play her own game. She asked about dates, itineraries, and costs as if she were interested. She even commented, "Well, I could see about adjusting a few things to help you." Her daughter breathed a sigh of relief, like someone who already saw the money in her hand. But Linda, inwardly, was weaving another plot. It wasn't about revenge. It was about inverting the situation. That this time, her daughter would receive something more valuable than the money. A lesson. One that would stick around long after the trip was over. The conversation ended with a, "Thanks, Mum. I knew I could count on you." Linda slowly hung up the phone, looking at her reflection in the window. She didn't feel used, because she wasn't the same person as before. She felt in control of the situation, in control of her decisions. Her daughter's pride was still intact, but now Linda held the strong card. The move wasn't immediate, because real lessons aren't served on fast food trays. Linda was going to wait for the exact moment to deliver something very different from what she was asking for. And that moment was approaching. That night, she took the dress out of the closet and placed it on the bed. The fabric shone with the same intensity as the day she bought it, but the meaning was different. She stroked it slowly, as if weaving thoughts into every fold. "It's not your time yet, but soon," she murmured. The image of her daughter receiving that dress, instead of the money, made her smile. Not out of malice, but out of fairness, because sometimes what you need isn't what you ask for, and Linda was ready to prove it. She turned off the room light and let the darkness guard the plan. The board was set for the next move. Inside her, a new calm settled, the kind that comes when one takes control. There was no anger, no resentment, only the certainty that she was doing the right thing. She knew there would be surprise, perhaps even anger, when her daughter discovered that the loan wouldn't come as she imagined. But she also knew that without discomfort, there is no growth. Linda wasn't cruel, But she wasn't naive either, and the time had come for her daughter to learn that love isn't measured in dollar bills. Money helps, yes, but respect. Respect sustains everything, and that's what she was about to teach her. Linda had been, throughout her daughter's life, that safe harbour she always returned to, the one who settled bills, the one who covered debts, the one who bought last-minute tickets so she wouldn't be left out. It didn't matter if it meant adjusting her own budget or postponing a personal pleasure. The answer had always been a yes wrapped in tenderness. It was an almost automatic habit, like putting sugar in coffee without thinking. But this time, as she reviewed the conversation from the day before, she realized that something inside her had changed. That impulse to save her, to protect her from any discomfort, no longer weighed the same. Not because she wanted to see her suffer, but because she understood that excessive rescuing also weakens, and that saying yes without measure is another way of saying no to oneself. She poured herself coffee at sunrise, watching the steam rise as if they were escaping thoughts. She remembered when, as a child, her daughter would ask for candy before a meal, and she would give in with a smile. She remembered the times she lent her the car, even when she didn't really need it, just to avoid an argument. She even remembered paying her rent when she herself was traveling, so her daughter wouldn't worry. All those yeses were like bricks that built a house, but not of love, but of habit. And habit, she knew well, is a difficult guest to evict. That day, while the coffee cooled in her hands, she decided that the next answer would not be automatic. She was going to lock that door that was always open. It wasn't an act of late rebellion or settling scores. It was love in its strictest form, the kind that teaches that there won't always be a safety net under the trapeze. Linda knew that if she said yes again, she would be validating her daughter's oversight towards her, not because of the money, but because of what it symbolized, that she could leave her out of important moments and still expect unconditional support. That thought pierced her like a cold flash of lightning, and in that instant, she understood that every yes in the past had fueled not only gratitude, but also a bit of unintentional abuse. No guilt, no resentment, just the clarity of seeing the pattern. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The day proceeded calmly, with the distant sound of a radio playing at a neighbour's house. Linda took the opportunity to organise the closet, and there was the dress, hanging like a silent declaration. She looked at it and felt that it had become a kind of talisman, a reminder that her worth did not depend on how many favours she did, but on who she was, with or without invitations. She ran her hand over the fabric and thought, no more yes out of reflex. It wasn't about closing the door on her daughter, but about opening a new one for her, the door of responsibility. Because in the end, true love isn't the kind that always says yes, but the kind that knows when a no can save you. And that was the lesson that was beginning to form. In the afternoon, the phone vibrated with a message. "Mum, have you thought about the trip yet?" Linda read it without haste, like someone reviewing a bill without the urgency to pay it. She replied with a simple, "Yes, I've thought about it." She didn't explain further, didn't add emojis, didn't embellish the phrase. She knew that curiosity would start to do its work, because sometimes doubt is more uncomfortable than an immediate no. And she wanted her daughter to feel that small void, that space where one realizes that not everything is guaranteed. It was the beginning of new territory for both of them. Night arrived with a gentle breeze that moved the living room curtains. Linda sat down with a notebook and began to write down expenses, income, and goals she had for herself. Something she hadn't done in a long time, because she always put her own plan second. Writing it down made her feel like the owner of her life again. She realized that it was never a bad time to reconnect with oneself, and that every no she was about to tell her daughter was, in reality, a yes for herself, a yes for her projects, her peace, her dignity, and that, for a woman who had always lived for others, was pure gold. There were people who, in a brief call with a friend, would have said, "Oh, but she's your daughter, don't deny her." Linda smiled with that calm that only comes from having thought things over 1,000 times. "I'm not denying her. I'm teaching her," she replied. The friend fell silent, as if understanding that there was something deeper there, because always saying yes doesn't guarantee love, and sometimes even weakens it. Linda hung up and felt that the guilt that threatened to appear was slowly dissolving. In its place remained a conviction as firm as stone. The conviction that this time her yes would take a different form. In her mind, the plan was already clear. She wasn't going to give her money. She would give her something she didn't expect, something that would make her stop and think. That something took the form of a memory, a mirror, a choice wrapped in surprise. And for that, the dress would play a starring role. Because although her daughter didn't know it yet, that dress had not been bought in vain. Every stitch, every fold, carried a story that she herself had tried to erase. And Linda, with the patience of a seamstress, was ready to give it back to her. Not as a complaint, but as a reminder that could not be ignored. The dawn found her awake, staring at the ceiling and mentally rehearsing the exact words she would use. She didn't want to hurt. She wanted to shake things up. She didn't want to close the door. She wanted her daughter to knock, to come in. And for that, the boundary had to be clear, without needing to raise her voice or dramatize. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing one can do is speak softly and let the truth carry its own weight. And Linda mastered that like few others. She took a deep breath and finally let sleep reach her, because she knew that the coming days would be decisive. At dawn, while preparing her breakfast, she caught herself humming an old song. She wasn't sad, she was determined, and that difference could be felt in her shoulders, in her straight back, in the way she walked. The phone was still on the table, silent, as if waiting for the final answer. But Linda wasn't in a hurry, because time, when you know what you want, stops being an enemy and becomes an ally. And in that silent pact with the clock, she knew she was about to take one of the most important steps of her life, one that would mark her relationship with her daughter forever. Monday dawned with a leaden sky, one of those that seem like a premonition. Linda was sweeping the patio when she heard the voice of Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor across the street, who always had a comment ready for any occasion. "Linda, did you hear the party was fantastic?" she called out from the fence with that mix of gossip and enthusiasm that doesn't ask permission to enter. Linda rested the broom against the wall, feigning interest, though a pang shot through her chest. "Yes, honey, but I couldn't go," she replied with serenity. The neighbor moved a little closer, lowering her voice as if they were accomplices. "Well, they say they moved it up so you wouldn't run into certain people. You know, your late husband's cousins." And there, as if someone had turned on a bright light in a dark room, everything began to make sense. Linda fell silent, assimilating every word. It hadn't been an impromptu date change, as her daughter said. It had been planned, and not for Linda's convenience, but to avoid an awkward encounter. The idea hit her with a mix of anger and sadness. That much of an inconvenience, she thought, without letting her face show anything. Mrs. Henderson kept talking, describing the tables, the music, the dresses. Every detail was like a drop falling onto a freshly opened wound. Linda nodded, like someone listening to a recipe, but in her head, there was no longer a party, but a betrayal. The neighbor, unaware of the magnitude of what she was revealing, continued her enthusiastic account, mentioning the photos, the cake, the emotional toast. Linda smiled politely, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. It was one of those smiles one puts on to avoid giving more away than one receives. And while the other woman spoke, Linda remembered the times she had defended her daughter against malicious comments from relatives. How many times had she been the shield, the voice that calmed storms in tense gatherings? And now, they had left her out as if she were a threat. That, more than the hanging dress, was what she wouldn't forget. When Mrs. Henderson said goodbye, Linda closed the door and leaned against it for a moment. The silence of the house enveloped her again, but now it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a cold blanket that helped her think. It wasn't the time to confront, but to observe. Because when a lie unravels on its own, the culprit ends up trapped in their own words. Linda knew that if her daughter had dared to invent a story, it was because she had taken for granted that she would never verify it. And that was a mistake, one that was about to cost her dearly, because there is no worse judge than a disappointed mother. She sat down at the dining room table with a glass of water in her hand and mentally reviewed every gesture, every phrase of the past few days. It was impromptu, the change of subject, the rush to end the conversation. Everything fit together like a puzzle to which the missing piece suddenly appeared. Linda felt the anger rise, but she tamed it with a long breath. She wasn't going to react impulsively. She learned long ago that impulsive reactions give others control of the narrative. And this time, she was going to tell the story, in her own time. She took the dress out of the closet and placed it on the table, looking at it as one looks at an ally. That dress, which had been meant for a day of joy, would now be the cornerstone of something much bigger. "You wanted to leave me out," she thought, "but you are going to learn that a mother is never truly out of the game." She ran her hand over the fabric, feeling its softness, and imagined the exact moment she would hand it to her daughter. Not as a gift, but as a mirror. As a reminder that decisions have consequences, and that respect, once broken, costs much more than any dress. That idea gave her a strange calm, a dangerous calm. In the middle of the afternoon, the phone vibrated with a message from her daughter. "Mum, have you decided about the trip yet?" Linda read it and left it unanswered. For the first time in a long time. Not to punish, but to take control of the timing and the tone. She knew that silence could be more uncomfortable than any sermon, and that in that space of waiting, the other person begins to question themselves alone. Meanwhile, she continued her day as if nothing were happening. She washed the dishes, watered the plants, played soft music. Because patience, used well, is the most elegant weapon. That night, while preparing tea, she listened again to the neighbor's words in her head. Every sentence was like a needle in the fabric of her trust. She didn't need proof or witnesses, she knew enough. And that was enough to make a decision that would have no turning back. The trip would be the perfect moment to open the box and let the lesson breathe. It wasn't about money, it was about respect. And respect, for Linda, was the foundation of everything. The day it is lost, one must work to recover it, if it can be. She got into bed with the certainty that she wouldn't share that information yet. It was her hidden card, and she wasn't going to show it ahead of time. While her daughter thought she was still considering it, Linda had already decided the outcome. And that advantage, silent and firm, gave her a feeling of control she hadn't felt in a long time. She settled under the covers and let sleep envelop her. She didn't dream of the lost party or the betrayal. She dreamed of the moment of truth. and that dream made her smile in the darkness. The next morning, Linda woke up early, before the sun touched the living room walls. She made strong coffee, the kind that scratches your throat a little and clears your head. She sat at the table with a blank sheet of paper and a black ink pen. She didn't plan to write to send it. She knew that from the beginning, but she needed to put the words in order, give them form outside her head so they would stop bouncing around like stones. She took a deep breath and began. Daughter, I'm not writing to complain, but to remind you who I am. As the ink flowed, the knot in her chest loosened. It was like pulling out thorns one by one, being careful not to break the skin. She wrote about the excitement of the dress, about the moment she heard the phrase, "The party was yesterday." She didn't exaggerate, but she didn't soften the blow either. She clearly stated the weight of that absence, the coldness of the silence afterward. She didn't apologize for feeling hurt, because she understood that her pain was legitimate. She also wrote about the times she had said yes, even when saying yes left her with nothing for herself. She recalled birthdays, Christmases, sick days where her presence had been the constant. In those lines, there was no resentment. There was memory. And memory, when written without lies, has an edge that cuts without shouting. Each sentence was like a conversation they never had. Linda imagined her daughter's responses, the evasions, the justifications. And still, she wrote as if the paper had the ability to listen without interrupting. It was a silent, but intense, dialogue. In one part, she wrote, "It doesn't hurt that I missed the party. It hurts that you didn't care that I missed it." That line left her still for a moment, watching the ink dry. She knew that if her daughter ever read it, that sentence would stick with her, because the truth doesn't need adornments to carry weight. She also spoke about the trip she had requested, and how that request felt strange after everything. She wrote, "I can't keep holding up a bridge that you don't want to walk on." There was no threat, only the statement of a boundary. She made it clear that helping her was not a blind duty, but a choice that required care and reciprocity. As the words flowed, Linda noticed that her breathing became more steady. The initial anger had transformed into a kind of firm serenity, the same one felt when one knows that, whatever happens, one will not yield in the same way again. And that was, in itself, an irreversible change. Writing also allowed her to see her own mistakes. She acknowledged that she had fueled that habit of asking without thanking, that she had said yes out of love, but also out of fear of being pushed aside, that she had allowed her presence to be taken for granted, as if it were eternal and unconditional, and that now, without resentment, she was willing to change the rules of the game. That self-criticism did not weaken her. On the contrary, it strengthened her, because understanding her part in the story gave her more control over what would come next. And what would come next was already clear. When she finished writing, she folded the sheet of paper into 3 parts and put it in an unaddressed envelope. She left it in the bottom drawer of the desk, next to old letters and black and white photos. There was no intention for her daughter to read it soon, or maybe ever. It was more for herself, to have a record of how she felt at that exact moment. Because time, with its tricks, sometimes erases important details. And Linda didn't want to forget what that wound had taught her, not to fuel the pain, but to remember the value of her own boundaries, a reminder that wouldn't fade with the routine. She got up from the table with a lightness she hadn't felt in days. It was as if the act of writing had drained some of the accumulated tension. She went to the kitchen, poured herself more coffee, and looked out the window as the day brightened. She thought that perhaps we don't always need the other person to hear our words. Sometimes it's enough just to say them, even if only to paper. That thought gave her an unexpected peace. because she no longer depended on her daughter's reaction to feel relief. She could give herself that closure, even if it was private. Mid-morning, she received another message. "What have you thought about the trip, Mum?" Linda smiled when she read it. Not because the insistence bothered her, but because now she knew exactly how to handle it. She wasn't going to respond yet. She wanted her daughter to learn that quick answers aren't always the norm, that there was value in waiting, in reflection, in the silence that precedes an important response. And while the phone remained on the table, she decided to go out to the garden to water the plants. Because life, like flowers, grows better when the process isn't forced. The envelope with the letter stayed in its place all day, like a silent witness. Linda knew that if she ever decided to deliver it, she would do so at a key moment, a moment when the words wouldn't become an attack, but a mirror. Until then, it would remain guarded like a gentle weapon, with an invisible edge, one that doesn't cut the skin, but can open the conscience. And with that idea, she felt she had something more powerful than any amount of money she could lend. She had the truth, and the truth does not devalue, not even over time. That night, before going to sleep, she opened the closet and looked at the dress for a few seconds. She felt that the dress and the letter were linked by the same invisible thread. Both were witnesses to a story that was still being written. Both were pieces of a lesson that would soon arrive, and although her daughter didn't know it, she was already caught in the fabric of that teaching. Linda turned off the light, wrapped herself up, and let the silence accompany her. But this time, the silence no longer screamed, it whispered. And what it whispered was, "Wait, not yet." Linda knew that a true lesson isn't given with shouting or reproaches. It is cooked slowly, like her grandmother's turkey and mashed potatoes, over a low flame, and with ingredients that seem simple, but together change everything. After writing and saving the letter, she began to mentally connect the pieces. She wasn't going to lend her the money for the trip, but she wasn't going to say so abruptly either. She wanted her daughter to believe that everything was still the same, that the answer would be yes, as always, because the blow wouldn't be the refusal. It would be the message that came with it. That message wouldn't be forgotten upon returning from vacation. It would stick around, like those songs you can't stop humming. She remained silent in the following days, responding to messages with short but cordial phrases. She wasn't putting her off, but she wasn't confirming anything either. It was a calculated balance, just enough to keep the expectation alive. She knew that her daughter, trusting the usual pattern, wouldn't see anything coming. That was the point. The surprise wouldn't just hurt, it would open her eyes. And Linda, like a chess player, moved each piece without rushing, because patience, in this game, was her best ally. And she had plenty of it. Meanwhile, she began to prepare the dress for the decisive moment. She took it to the dry cleaners, asked for it to be pressed, and returned impeccable, like new. She wanted there to be no doubt of its value when she placed it in her daughter's hands. That dress represented the party they didn't share, the love that isn't recognized, and the dignity that is non-negotiable. She wouldn't say it with words. She would say it with the weight of the fabric and the silence that accompanied it. The idea of that moment kept her serene, even excited, not because of the act itself, but because of the clarity she felt in knowing that she was not acting out of anger. She was acting out of conviction. She also prepared a small package next to the dress, a box with photos of them at different moments in their lives, from childhood to just a few years ago. The photos were not chosen randomly. Each one showed an instant where Linda's presence had been key, where her daughter smiled because she was there. She wanted the images to speak louder than any sermon when the box was opened, that the confrontation would not be verbal, but emotional. Because in the end, the heart understands better than the ears, and that was the door Linda wanted to knock on. During those days, she avoided talking about the trip with other people. She didn't want opinions. She didn't want anyone to try to soften the lesson. She knew that if she heard, "Oh, but she's your daughter, don't deny her," she might waver. So, she shielded her decision with external silence and internal reflection. The plan grew like a potted plant, discreet, protected, invisible to those who don't know how to look. Meanwhile, her daughter kept sending messages, asking indirectly. Linda responded with just the right warmth, no more, no less. It was as if she were tuning an instrument before a concert. The day she decided everything was ready, she woke up early and tidied the living room. She put fresh flowers in the vase. She opened the curtains to let in the light. The dress, impeccable, was in a fabric bag next to the box of photos. Linda placed them on the dining room table, covered with a white cloth. She looked at the scene and felt it was like preparing an altar, not of farewell, but of truth, a space where lies and habit would have no place. She breathed deeply and told herself, "Today's the day." And with that calm, she waited for the call. When the phone rang, her daughter was on the other end, with that mixture of confidence and hurry. "Mum, so are you going to help me with the trip?" Linda smiled to herself, not mockingly, but from the knowledge that this moment had arrived. "Sure. Come over and we'll talk about it in person," she replied, using a friendly, almost affectionate tone. She knew that invitation would ignite her daughter's hope. It was part of the plan, that she would arrive confident, without defenses. The true lesson was only a few hours away, and Linda could already imagine the expression on her face. She spent the rest of the day preparing coffee, cookies, and a calm atmosphere. She didn't want the conversation to happen amidst tension or anger. She wanted everything to seem normal until it stopped being so. It was a carefully staged scenario so that the lesson would sink in on its own. She didn't need to raise her voice or dramatize. The weight of the objects on the table would do everything, and her daughter, upon seeing them, would understand without need for many explanations. That was the art of teaching without imposing. As evening fell, Linda looked in the mirror before her daughter arrived. She wasn't trying to intimidate. She was aiming to be firm and calm. She put on a sober blouse, a simple hairstyle, and a touch of perfume she used on special occasions. This wasn't just any meeting. In the mirror, she saw a woman who had learned not to waste her energy on those who don't value it. And that woman was ready to hold her daughter's gaze without blinking, because in that gaze would be the true message, and she wasn't going to tremble. The doorbell rang, and Linda's heart beat a little faster, but not from nerves. It was a mix of anticipation and closure. She opened the door with a smile that revealed nothing of the plan. She invited her in, offered her coffee, and they talked briefly about unimportant things, until, without prolonging the moment further, Linda pointed to the package on the table. "This is what I have for you," she said, with a firm but gentle voice. Her daughter didn't understand at first, but in seconds, confusion began to register on her face. Linda knew that this was the start of the second part of the lesson, opening the package and letting the images and the dress speak. But she wasn't in a hurry, because sometimes the real impact isn't in the surprise, but in the waiting for what is about to be revealed. And in that pause, as her daughter looked at the bundle covered by the white cloth, Linda felt that everything she had planned was exactly where it should be. The silence filled the living room again, but this time, the silence was hers. The coffee was served, and the aroma filled the room, but that was not what occupied her daughter's mind. Linda could see it. Those restless eyes moved from the cup to the package on the table, like someone sensing that something important was about to happen. She took a slow sip without rushing, letting the silence work in her favor. Her daughter finally broke the calm. "And this? Is this the money?" Linda offered a faint smile, the kind that doesn't preempt answers. "Not exactly," she said, as she carefully lifted the white cloth covering the package. First, the wooden box appeared, then the fabric bag with the dress. The air seemed to grow denser. "I want you to open it," Linda said, pushing the box toward her. Her daughter obeyed, still with a shadow of confusion. Inside, the photos began to appear, one by one. The child on the beach, the teenager at her graduation, the two of them laughing in the kitchen. In every image, Linda's presence was evident, solid, constant. Her daughter looked at them without speaking, as if suddenly a heavy weight had fallen upon her. Linda didn't interrupt, didn't. She knew the images spoke louder than any speech. Then, she handed her the bag with the dress. As she opened it, the folds shone under the afternoon light. "It's the dress I bought for your party," Linda said, her voice soft but firm. Her daughter looked down at the fabric, and then the memory of that day became inevitable. She swallowed, but didn't say anything. Linda continued, "You left me out that day, and although it hurt, I learned that I can't keep saying yes while you are saying no to me in other ways." There was no anger in her voice, only the certainty of someone who knows she owns her boundaries. Her daughter closed the bag, as if she couldn't hold it for long. For the first time in a long time, she seemed not to have a ready answer. And that, for Linda, was already a change. "I'm not going to lend you money for this trip," Linda stated plainly. "And it's not because of the money, it's because of what it means." Her daughter looked up, with a gesture between surprise and bewilderment. "You've always been able to count on me," Linda continued, "but I'm not going to support what leaves me out. If you want my help, I also want your respect." The living room fell silent. Only the ticking of the wall clock could be heard. That sound, previously invisible, now marked every second with a new weight. Linda let it be. Her daughter tried to say something. "Mom, I didn't mean to." Linda gently raised her hand, asking for a pause. "I don't need explanations right now. I just want you to think about what I'm telling you." Her voice wasn't trembling, but she wasn't trying to sound harsh either. It was the tone of someone who knows that seeds don't sprout the moment they are planted. Her daughter nodded slowly, and her fingers fidgeted with the edge of the photo box. It was as if those images had become an uncomfortable mirror, one she couldn't stop looking at. When she stood up to leave, there were no slammed doors or hurtful phrases. Linda walked her to the door and gave her a kiss on the cheek. "Think about it, honey. I'll be here," she said, and those last words sounded more like a promise than a warning. Her daughter walked down the street with the dress in one hand and the box in the other. From the window, Linda watched her walk away, and for an instant, she felt a mixture of relief and sadness. It wasn't easy to set boundaries, especially with someone you love, but there was a new peace in knowing she had done it with dignity, without shouting, without humiliating. The rest of the afternoon passed in calm. Linda returned to the table, where the folded white cloth remained. She picked it up and put it in the drawer, as if closing a chapter. She knew her daughter would need time to process what had happened. Maybe she would get upset. Maybe she would distance herself a little more. Or maybe she would understand. That maybe didn't scare her. Because now, more than ever, she was clear that true love is not about always saying yes. It is about teaching to value every yes that is given. That night, While preparing her tea, she remembered her mother's words. It's not about what you give, but what you teach while giving it. And she understood that that afternoon she had done exactly that. She hadn't given her money, but she had given her something more valuable, a mirror to look into, one that showed both the beautiful and the uncomfortable, one that hopefully would accompany her for a long time. Linda smiled to herself, feeling her heart beat lighter. The lesson had been given. Now all that remained was to wait for its fruit. 3 days passed in absolute silence. Not a message, not a call, not even a good morning that slipped through carelessly. Linda didn't take it as an offense, but as a confirmation. The lesson had touched a nerve. During that time, she dedicated herself to her routines without letting anxiety gnaw at her. She watered the plants, tidied closets, visited a friend for coffee. But inwardly, she knew her daughter's absence wouldn't be eternal. When someone isn't used to hearing a no, that word keeps bouncing around in their head. And sooner or later, the need to respond is stronger than pride. On the 4th day, as evening fell, the doorbell rang. Linda opened the door, and there was her daughter, standing, with the box of photos in her hands. She didn't have the dress. The greeting was brief, a hi that seemed to hold many trapped phrases. She entered without being invited, walked to the living room, and left the box on the table. Linda followed her calmly, without rushing the moment. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, using that neutral tone that neither pushes nor pulls away. Her daughter shook her head and took a deep breath before speaking. "Mum, what you did hurt me." Linda didn't answer immediately. She looked at her, maintaining her calm, and said, "What was it that hurt you?" Her daughter shrugged, as if the words resisted her. "That you gave me that, instead of helping me with the trip." Linda nodded and in a calm voice replied, "It wasn't instead of. It was so you would understand something." Her daughter frowned, not fully understanding. Linda took a breath and continued, "That dress and those photos are proof that I've always been there for you. But if you leave me out, how can I be with you in what comes next?" The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. Her daughter tried to defend herself. "I didn't mean to leave you out. It was complicated." Linda smiled without irony, but with firmness. "You won't always have everyone, honey, and respect is what ensures that those who love you want to keep being there." That sentence fell like a stone in water without a splash, but creating ripples that expanded. Her daughter lowered her gaze, and for a second, Linda saw something different. It wasn't defiance, it was vulnerability. That small crack gave her hope, but she didn't use it to soften the boundary, because she knew that if she yielded now, everything would go back to how it was before. "What if I apologize?" her daughter asked, barely audible. "I would accept it," Linda said, "but it wouldn't change my decision about the trip." Her daughter looked up, surprised. "Why not?" Linda rested her hands on the table. "Because apologies don't erase what was done. Respect is recovered with time, not with immediate words." There was no anger in her voice, only the conviction of someone who knows the weight of her principles. Her daughter leaned back in the chair, processing. For the first time, she seemed to understand that not everything was resolved in an instant. A few long seconds passed before her daughter spoke again. "You made me think about everything you've done for me." Linda nodded but didn't smile. "That's what I wanted. For you to think. For you to understand that what you receive from me is not an obligation. It is love. And love, honey, must be taken care of." Her daughter swallowed, and the atmosphere shifted slightly. There was no longer confrontation. There was dialogue. An uncomfortable dialogue, yes, but necessary. And although she didn't say it, Linda knew those words were taking root. It wasn't about winning an argument, but about opening a space for the truth to enter. Finally, her daughter stood up. "I'm going to leave, but I'll hold on to what you said." Linda walked her to the door, and before she stepped out, she touched her arm. "I'm not closed off to helping you, honey, but I need to know that when I say yes to you, you are also saying yes to me in what matters." Her daughter nodded, and this time she didn't look away. Linda closed the door calmly. There was no victory, but there was progress, and that, in her experience, was worth more than an immediate agreement. That night, while pouring her tea, she thought about how strange maternal love is. How can it be tough and gentle at the same time? How can it deny in order to protect? How can it be silent in order to teach? She recalled the times her own mother had also left her alone with her decisions. Then she understood that the cycle was not a punishment, but an inheritance, and that hopefully her daughter would one day do the same for someone she loved. She smiled, not with pride, but with peace. Because although the battle was not over, the seed had been sown, and time, as always, would be her best ally. The following days were like a mild winter. There were no storms, but no full sun either. Linda felt the void of the short calls and quick visits, but she didn't experience it as a punishment. On the contrary, she took it as a necessary rest for her heart. Loneliness, she thought, is not always absence. Sometimes it is a clean space where one can listen to oneself better. In the mornings, the silence of the house seemed like a blank canvas. She could read without interruptions, cook without rushing, think without having to justify every thought. That time became a refuge to regain strength. And in that refuge, she began to heal from something deeper than the party episode. It wasn't the first time she had distanced herself from someone important. Throughout her life, she had learned that relationships are not measured only by physical closeness, but by the respect that sustains them. And if that respect is broken, sometimes the only way to repair it is to take a step back. In that pause, Linda returned to noticing details about herself that she had stopped seeing. Her enjoyment of long walks, her habit of writing brief notes about what she felt, her patience for embroidery. It was like reuniting with an old friend who had always been there. And that friend reminded her that she wasn't alone in the essential things, that her own company was enough to keep her whole. The phone rang occasionally, but she no longer felt obliged to answer immediately. She responded when she considered it appropriate, without guilt or anxiety. Each time she did, she noticed that her daughter was less tense, as if the time between conversations softened the edges. It was confirmation of something she had always known, but rarely practiced. That not being available all the time gives value to the presence when it is there. That measured distance was becoming part of the lesson, and Linda saw clearly that it was working. Not to create resentment, but to awaken consciousness. In the afternoons, she dedicated herself to small projects she always postponed. She painted a wall in the living room, reorganized the family albums, planted new flowers in the garden. Every task was a way of reaffirming herself. I am here, with myself. Loneliness, far from sinking her, gave her structure. It was no longer just about teaching her daughter, but about reminding herself that her value did not depend on her role as a mother, that she could exist fully as a woman, as an independent person. And that revelation had a sweet, almost liberating taste, like strong coffee on a cold morning. Sometimes, at night, she thought about her daughter's reaction the day of the delivery. She saw her holding the dress and the photos, quiet, and wondered if that image would still visit her. She didn't expect an immediate change. Deep lessons don't grow overnight, but she did have the certainty that something had shifted. And that movement, although invisible, was already enough for her. Meanwhile, loneliness continued to be her ally, a space to reorder priorities and clean old wounds. And every day that passed, she felt a little lighter. There were moments when nostalgia tried to creep in, especially when seeing families gathered in the square, or mothers and daughters laughing in coffee shops. But she wouldn't allow that feeling to steal the calm she had conquered. She knew that those scenes were only part of the story, not the whole truth. She had had those moments too, and she would have them again when the time was right. She wasn't living in expectation of them, but she wasn't closing the door either. Loneliness taught her to accept what came, without forcing what wasn't ready yet, and that, for Linda, was a lesson as valuable as any reconciliation. In one of those quiet afternoons, she found an old box of letters she had exchanged with her mother. She read them slowly, savouring every word, and felt an echo of what she was experiencing now. Her mother had also known how to take distance when she considered it necessary, not out of lack of love, but out of self-respect. That parallel made her smile. Perhaps, without knowing it, she was repeating an inherited lesson, one that is not taught with manuals, but with silent example. And she promised herself that no matter what, her daughter would understand it someday. Maybe she would even be grateful for it. Loneliness also taught her to set boundaries without feeling guilty. She began to say no to commitments that didn't interest her, to requests that weren't fair. Every time she did, she felt her inner voice strengthening. It was like sharpening a knife that had been stored away for too long. That edge wasn't meant to hurt, but to cut away what didn't serve her. And in that cut, she found deep relief. Loneliness, far from being a burden, had become her teacher, one who didn't shout, but taught with clarity. One Sunday afternoon, while having tea in the garden, she received a short message from her daughter. "Mum, can I come see you this week?" Linda smiled, not because it was a great phrase, but because it sounded different. There was no hidden request or disguised urgency, just a desire to be together. That was the fruit of the distance, turning the meeting into a choice, not an obligatory routine. And although she didn't reply immediately, she knew the answer would be yes, because that loneliness that had healed her was also opening the door to reunion. That night, she looked in the mirror and was surprised by her tranquil expression. There was no longer hardness in her gaze, only determination. Loneliness had brought her back to herself, and she wouldn't trade that for anything. Now, if her daughter returned, it would be by mutual decision, not obligation. And that, in her heart, was already a victory. She went to bed with the certainty that the toughest lessons are also the most generous, because they not only transform the other person, but also the one who teaches them. And she felt stronger than ever. On Tuesday afternoon, Linda was folding laundry when she heard gentle knocking at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment, she thought it might be the neighbour with an errand. But when she opened it, she found her daughter standing there, makeup-free, with her hair quickly pulled back and her eyes slightly swollen. She didn't have that confident sparkle she always arrived with, nor the smile she used as a shield. Instead, she brought a silence that weighed more than any word. "Can I come in?" she asked, with a voice that seemed careful not to break. Linda stepped aside, and in that gesture, there was no judgment, only space. She knew that what was coming wasn't just any visit. Her daughter sat on the sofa, her hands clasped and her gaze fixed on the floor. Linda watched her, in no rush to fill the air. She had learned that confessions are not pulled out, they are waited for. A few long seconds passed before she heard, "Mum, I was wrong." That phrase fell like a heavy sigh, and Linda received it calmly. There was no joy, but a deep relief, because it was unusual to hear her daughter let down her guard, much less admit a mistake without immediate excuses. "I know the party thing was bad, and asking about the trip was worse after that," she continued. Linda didn't interrupt. She let her speak, empty herself, organize what she had been holding in for weeks. "I felt bad from the first day, but I was embarrassed to come and tell you. I thought if I acted like nothing happened, it would just go away, but it didn't." Linda nodded slowly. "Something don't heal on their own," she said, with a gentle voice that wasn't looking to reproach. Her daughter looked up, and in her eyes, there was no longer that constant defense. There was, finally, vulnerability. In that moment, Linda understood that the mask had fallen. It wasn't just the confession, it was the way, unadorned, without anger, without trying to be right. Her daughter was there, present, with no roles to play. She was the same girl who ran to hug her after a stumble, only with more years on her. And although the wound wouldn't disappear immediately, seeing that honesty felt like the ice beginning to break. Linda didn't rush to hug her, because she knew this moment needed space, but she made it clear that she was listening, and that her presence wasn't conditional. That, more than any sermon, was the foundation for rebuilding. "I understand you don't always want to help me, Mum," her daughter said, lowering her voice. Linda smiled slightly. "It's not about wanting. It's about how you ask and what's behind it." Her daughter nodded, and that gesture was more honest than any promise. She didn't offer to change overnight, nor did she swear she would never make a mistake again. She only acknowledged that she understood what her mother was saying, and that understanding was more important than any empty promise. Inwardly, Linda felt that the lesson had yielded its first real fruit, a small but genuine one. There was a brief silence, and then her daughter asked, "Can I stay for a while?" Linda replied with a simple, "Sure," and went to the kitchen to prepare tea. There was no need to talk too much or unpack the entire past all at once. The reunion, she thought, is built with small bricks, not with grand speeches. She returned to the living room with 2 cups and placed them on the table. Her daughter smiled faintly, as if the tea were a symbol of truce. Linda smiled back, thinking that perhaps it wasn't a truce. Maybe it was the beginning of something new, something that wouldn't have happened without the previous distance. While they drank in silence, Linda remembered that sometimes, for someone to drop the mask, you have to withdraw just enough. Not to disappear, but so the other person sees their own reflection without distractions. That had been her plan from the beginning, even though she never said it out loud. And now, seeing her daughter across from her, she knew it had worked. Not perfectly, but enough to open a door she was willing to keep open, as long as there was respect from both sides. That thought gave her a deep peace, even deeper than any momentary victory. When her daughter stood up to leave, there were no long words. A "thanks, Mum" was enough. Linda walked her to the door, and before she left, she looked her straight in the eyes. "What matters most to me is that we can talk like this," she said. Her daughter nodded, and this time she didn't look away. Linda closed the door gently and stood in the hallway, taking a deep breath. It wasn't a happy ending yet, but it was a dignified ending to that chapter, and that, for her, was everything. That night, before going to sleep, she thought about how life always finds a way to remove masks, sooner or later. Sometimes it does it with a blow, other times with a whisper. In her case, it had been with patience, distance, and a dress that was never worn. She smiled to herself, feeling that the dress had fulfilled its purpose without the need for a party, because it wasn't the garment that mattered, but what it represented. And in that moment, it represented the day her daughter stopped hiding behind pride, and that was priceless. A few weeks passed without grand gestures or deep conversations. Linda wasn't seeking them. She knew that what they had talked about needed time to settle. The relationship moved like a calm river, slow, constant, without sudden waves. Sometimes her daughter called her to ask for a recipe or tell her something about work. Small exchanges that seemed trivial, but for Linda were signs of ground being carefully tread again. There were no promises or repeated apologies, only a subtle effort to be present. And in that slow rhythm, Linda found peace, because she had learned that real affection doesn't need to rush to arrive. One Saturday morning, her daughter arrived without notice. She carried a bag with fresh-baked bread, and the aroma filled the kitchen as soon as she crossed the threshold. "I was passing by and thought of you," she said, like someone who wants her gesture to speak louder than words. Linda invited her in and served coffee without asking questions. The conversation was light, almost domestic. The weather, the new series they were watching, the price of gas. But beneath those simple topics was something more, a voluntary presence, not forced, one that Linda valued more than any gift. In the middle of the chat, her daughter looked toward the closet where the dress hung. She didn't say anything, but Linda noticed how her eyes lingered there for a second longer than normal. It was a brief silence, but loaded with meaning. Linda didn't interrupt it. She let the moment float. She knew that dress had become a symbol for both of them, a silent reminder of the distance they had experienced, and how they had found each other again. And although no one mentioned it, it was there, as a silent witness to what they had learned. There were no grand declarations that day, nor prolonged hugs. But upon leaving, her daughter said, "I like coming here. It feels different." Linda smiled, knowing that different was the perfect word. It was no longer the same place where she said yes to everything without thinking. Now it was a space where they could both be without masks, without rigid expectations. That change, though small, was profound. And Linda received it without haste, like someone who knows that good things are built slowly. Because reconciliations made in a hurry tend to unravel just as quickly. In the following days, messages became more frequent, but not invasive. They were simple. A photo of a nice place, a "how are you?" in the middle of the afternoon. Linda responded with the same simplicity. She didn't try to force long conversations, but she also didn't let contact cool. They were finding a middle ground, a comfortable rhythm for both of them. That balance was what they had lacked before. Now they valued it, though perhaps they didn't yet say it out loud. But Linda felt it in every exchange. One Sunday, her daughter invited her out to lunch. It was the first time in a long time that the invitation wasn't linked to a request or a commitment. She just wanted to share time. Linda accepted without hesitation, and that meal felt light, with no burdens from the past weighing on the table. They laughed, recalled anecdotes, and for a moment, everything seemed like before, but better. Because now there was more awareness of what it cost to reach that moment, more respect for the other's company. And that, for Linda, was the true reward. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were still things to talk about and wounds to heal. But now, neither of them seemed to be in a hurry. They had realized that trust doesn't return with a hug or a quick pardon. It is earned little by little, with small, consistent actions. Linda understood it and accepted it with gratitude. She knew that slow reconciliations are the ones that last the longest, and that this was the path they had chosen, even if it was unspoken. In one of those quiet visits, her daughter brought her flowers to brighten the house, she said. Linda placed them in a vase and thought that, in reality, they were brightening something deeper, the invisible space between them, the one that had been full of tension before. The flowers, like the relationship, didn't need explanations to be there. It was enough to care for them so they would grow, and Linda was willing to do it, without pressure, without rush, because she had learned that what is forced breaks. That night, while putting away the washed dishes, she thought about everything that had happened: the dress, the box of photos, the refusal of the trip. Everything seemed distant, but at the same time present. She didn't regret anything. She knew that if she had yielded then, this reunion wouldn't have the same value. Her daughter also didn't seem resentful. Rather, there was a new respect in her demeanor. That respect was the true gift she had been waiting for. And seeing it grow like this, without pushing, was a satisfaction that couldn't be bought. Not even with all the dollars in the world. Upon going to bed, Linda understood that the key word for this stage was patience. Patience to wait for the moment to speak, to accept small gestures as big advances, and not to demand more than the other person can give right now. That patience, which she once thought was a sacrifice, now felt like a gift she was giving to herself. And she knew that whatever happened next, they had already taken a huge step. One they wouldn't have taken if she hadn't decided to set boundaries in time. She fell asleep with a tranquil smile, ready for whatever came. Because when a reunion is without haste, there is no fear that it will end. The day they finally talked openly arrived without either of them planning it. It was a mild afternoon, with the light falling obliquely across the living room and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee floating in the air. Linda had invited her daughter over for no special reason, just to share some time. They sat facing each other, each with her cup, and the conversation started lightly, but soon took another turn. Her daughter, with a serious expression, said, "Mum, I think I finally understood what you were trying to tell me that day." Linda looked up, maintaining silence to give her space. "I understood that the problem wasn't the money. It was me not taking care of what you give me." That recognition, though brief, carried the weight of a sincere confession. Linda placed her cup on the table and rested her hands one on top of the other. "I don't want you to think it was a punishment," she began in a slow, steady tone. "It was a boundary, because I love you, and I don't want you to ever think that everything is automatic. Affection and respect need to be nurtured, honey. If not, they wither." Her daughter nodded, looking her directly in the eye, not running away from the truth. "I know, and I promise I'm going to take care of that. I don't want you to feel like I don't value you." Linda watched her in silence for a few seconds, searching her gaze for something more than words. She found it. It wasn't an empty promise. It was a commitment that was beginning to be born. And there she knew it was time to make a new pact. "I don't want us to go back to how it was before, with me always saying yes and you not realizing it," Linda continued. "I want it to be different. If you need me, ask me with your heart, not out of habit. And I, if I can, will be there. But I also want you to be there for me." Her daughter smiled faintly, a gesture that mixed relief and respect. "I can do that," she said. "I want to do that." Linda felt something settle inside her, like a piece finally finding its place. That can and want were clear signs that there was understanding. and understanding was the most solid foundation for any relationship. They remained silent for a moment, only listening to the distant noise of the street. There was no rush to keep talking. The calm they felt was already enough. Her daughter took Linda's hand, a gesture that needed no explanation. It was more than an act of affection. It was a tacit confirmation of the new deal. "I mean it, Mum. Thank you for not giving me the money," she suddenly said, smiling. Linda looked at her with a mixture of surprise and pride. "Thank you," she repeated. "Yes. If you had given it to me, I wouldn't have understood anything." That moment, so simple and so grand, closed a cycle that had begun with a wound. It wasn't about forgetting what happened, but about learning from it. Linda felt that she no longer carried the frustration from before. What remained now was a renewed respect, a clean look forward. Her daughter, for her part, seemed lighter, as if she had dropped a stone she had been carrying in her pocket for some time. That relief was noticeable in her voice, in her gestures. Both knew that not everything would be perfect, but that now they had a common language to care for each other, and that language wasn't learned in a day. Before leaving, her daughter stood up and walked to the closet where the dress hung. She took it out carefully and held it in front of her. "Mum, I think this dress has to be worn someday. I don't want it to stay stored forever." Linda smiled, understanding that she wasn't just referring to the fabric. "It will be worn," she said, "when the time is right." And both knew that that moment didn't depend on a party, but on the celebration of something more important, the way they had learned to love each other. That would be the true event worth dressing up for. At the door, before saying goodbye, they hugged. It wasn't a quick hug, but one that allowed for a few seconds longer than usual. The kind that makes it clear there is a bond that, even if it stretches, does not break. Linda took a deep breath and let that hug seal the new pact without needing more words. Her daughter walked away with the dress in her arms, and Linda stood watching her disappear down the street. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel worry or sadness. She felt certainty, and that certainty tasted like silent victory. That night, while jotting down some phrases in her notebook, Linda wrote, "The strongest pacts are those born of respect, not obligation." She closed the notebook and smiled. She didn't know when the right time to wear the dress would be, but she didn't care. She knew that day would come, and that when it did, they would both be ready. And in that thought, she found a peace that accompanied her until she fell asleep. The peace of someone who not only gets someone back, but gets them back better. And that, she thought, is the true triumph of any mother. The moment arrived without announcements or elaborate plans. It was a Friday night, months later, when her daughter called to invite Linda to a special dinner. "It's not my birthday or an anniversary, but I want you to come," she said, with a tone that no longer left room for doubt. Linda accepted without asking more, although inwardly she felt that vibration of important days. She took the dress out of the closet, caressed it like someone touching a living memory, and decided that this would be the occasion. As she dressed, she looked in the mirror and thought about everything that had happened since she bought it. That dress, which had been a witness to a wound, would now be a symbol of something earned, something neither of them had seen coming at the beginning. She arrived at the agreed-upon location and was greeted by a long table, lit with candles, surrounded by familiar faces and close friends. Her daughter, seeing her enter, smiled with a sparkle that wasn't forced, a clean sparkle. "Mum, this is for you," she said, and pointed to the sign in the back. "Thank you for teaching me what really matters." Linda felt her legs tremble, but not from weakness. but from pure emotion. The conversations, the silences, the boundaries, everything had culminated in that moment. And there, standing, with her burgundy dress shining under the warm light, she understood that poetic justice doesn't always come in the form of a verbal apology. Sometimes it comes in the form of public recognition, a gesture that says more than any word. And that night, she was receiving it. During dinner, her daughter spoke. There was a time when I thought my mum's love would always be there, no matter what I did. I was wrong. I learned that respect is what keeps that love alive, and it must be shown, not assumed. There was a respectful silence at the table. Linda looked at her, and for a second, she saw that girl again who ran toward her with open arms. But now she was no longer a child. She was a woman acknowledging what she had previously ignored. That recognition, in front of everyone, was an act of humility and gratitude, one that forever sealed the pact they had made in private, and which converted the initial wound into a firm bridge. When the toast was over, her daughter approached and whispered, "This dress really had to be worn today." Linda smiled, feeling that that phrase closed a cycle in the most perfect way possible. She didn't need anything more. No gifts, no applause, no extra explanations. Everything had been said in that moment. The dress had waited for its occasion and had found it. And just like their relationship, it had been saved and cared for to shine at the correct instant. That, Linda thought, was the true meaning of patience and of lessons taught with firm love. The night ended with soft music and genuine laughter. Linda returned home walking slowly, like someone who wants to prolong a memory. She didn't feel she had won a battle, but that she had completed a work. And the most beautiful thing was that this work was not made of sweet words, but of coherent actions, actions that had transformed a wound into a stronger bond. Upon arriving, she hung the dress again, but now not as an unresolved item, but as a silent trophy. One that would always remind her that sometimes, to teach someone to love, you have to dare to say no. Before sleeping, she wrote the last sentence in her notebook. "The respect that is earned with patience is the one that lasts forever." She closed the notebook and turned off the light. There were no tears, just calm, because she knew that that story, which began with an invisible slammed door, had ended with an open door, and that door no longer depended only on her, but on both of them. That, for Linda, was the fairest ending she could ask for, and with that certainty, she fell asleep, knowing that what she had sown would continue to flourish, even when she was no longer there to see it. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments what made you think the most. And also tell me what city or state you're listening from. I love knowing how far these words travel. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, because every week I bring more real stories, full of emotion, unexpected twists, and life lessons that can change the way you see relationships. Your support is what keeps this community alive, and there will always be a place for you here.